Good afternoon and welcome back to Early Modern Europe. This is our second lecture, so if you're watching this one first, go back to the other one. This will make so much more sense. Good to see you, everybody. I will be getting an announcement out to you this afternoon about this week and assignments and all the rest. But what I want to do today is I want to dive right in to our next lecture, because what we need to look at today is the age of exploration slash exploitation. And you're thinking, that seems a needlessly provocative word so early in the semester, but it is very accurate. Because one of the things that we are going to be seeing is that as soon as Europe starts to look out into the rest of the broader world, they are going to take advantage of things that they have that others don't. And one of the big ones is technology and technological development, especially where they're going to go. And so what we need to do today is we need to explore a fundamental question, and that is, what triggers the age of exploration, or the age of exploitation, the age of conquest, if we really want to talk about it in very stark historical terms. And then we have to ask ourselves, what were the results? And so those are the two things that we're going to be doing today. So we're looking at what triggered this, and then what were the results of this. Now, the triggers are fairly straightforward, and this is one of those things that what we would like to do is, what I would love to do is to take a number of steps backward into the High Middle Ages, and to really give us a sense of building up to this particular moment. But we'll kind of be doing that a little bit both this week and in the next lecture when I talk about the Renaissance, which, allow me just to say as a short digression, remember, the Renaissance is not actually its own age. It's simply the latter part of the late Middle Ages. The people of the Renaissance were medievals. They weren't early moderns, and that's really important. And so what we're looking at, by going back to the age of exploration, and then next time looking at the Renaissance, is that transition period, the movement from the medieval period into the early modern. And you're saying, well, why wouldn't we do that at the end of our medieval Europe class? Well, you kind of have to do both at the beginning of early modern and at the end of the medieval Europe course, because there's so much in flux. And there's so many fascinating things going on. And so let's look at some of the triggers for the age of exploration. And even that, triggers, I mean, it may be too specific of a term in the way we're thinking about it, because the trigger is like something happens and then these things happen, right? It's literally pulling the trigger of a gun, makes the gun go off. That's the thing that starts the process for everything that's going to come. And so I wouldn't exactly say that these are the things that start all of this, but they certainly prompt where they're going to go. And so let's look at some of these things that we're going to prompt the Europeans to say, hey, you know what? Maybe, just maybe, we need to find different ways to do the things that we're going to do, and in going in different directions. And the first one is just absolutely central, and that is trade. Maybe one of the most important reasons for the Europeans to get out into the broader world, especially for a lot of them, is this right here, trade, right? The ability to get luxury goods and hard to find goods and services from the rest of the world. And this is specifically, we're talking about at this point in time, most of Europe got their tradable goods through overland routes, right? Across through the Middle East, down what we call the Silk Road, right? That was the ancient term for it, but it was still the pathway between Europe and Asia, India, China, and all the rest. All right, So what were they looking for in those places? Well, it's really very straightforward. Spices, silk, gold, um, a lovely thing called salt that they can get from the Mediterranean, but it seems to be anywhere else. But it's spices, silks, and gold. All right. Pepper. It's a simple thing. Cardamom, cinnamon, all the rest. And so think about all of the spices that we see in the wide array of spices, especially from India, right? Where growing spices was one of the most important things that they did. And it was one of the most important tradable goods. All right. All of that stuff usually goes over land. Here's the problem, and it's a big one. Starting in the 1300s and especially into the 1400s, this is really going to be difficult because there's a new power arising in the Middle East, and these are the Ottoman Turks, right? It's not so much that they're Muslim, though they are, but that's really not the most important thing. Muslims had been controlling the Middle East since, well, the 8th century, right? They'd been at it for a long time. And throughout most of that period, Europeans had been able to figure out how to work through those regions to trade with the people in India and China and Southeast Asia. They just were able to do that because, and I know this may come as a surprise, but even when it comes to religion, you know what's even more important to human beings than their religion? Money. Cash. A lot of things can be looked over if you just pay the right fee. And for traders and the people and the places that they're going through, yes, their religion was important to them, but not so important that they didn't want to make money off the people going through their territories. It's really very simple. And thinking, well, if that's the case, then what in the world happens here or at this time? Well, the Ottoman Turks were getting tired of essentially the Christians from Europe traipsing through all the time because they did bring their religion and they also brought in their really bad attitudes about the last dying remnants of the crusading activities. And so they were trying to essentially secure their borders. They should sound familiar. And so what they wanted to do is they wanted to halt trade from Europe into Asia. They said, you want to get the stuff from India and China? That's fine. Go someplace else. Find a different route. You can go all you want. You just can't go through here, right? And the Europeans were like, well, that makes things very difficult. And so they had to look for other ways. Now, there are other overland routes. They're no good. They're much longer and they're much more difficult because they traipse up into the northern Asian steppes and up into what we now call Russia. And that's a long trip over some inhospitable terrain. It's not great. The other option, well, they weren't sure if there was another option. They assumed there was another option, but they couldn't be certain if that was going to work. And that was by sea, right? People have been probing a little bit down the coast of Africa since at least the time of, I don't know, the Phoenicians, right? A long time ago, at least as far back as 2000 BCE. But nobody had ever gotten all the way around Africa, and they weren't exactly sure if they could. And technologically, that was going to take some extra doing. All right, so trade is the first one. The second one is something we call mercantilism. This kind of goes hand in hand with trade. Mercantilism is an economic theory and practice very common during this period of time that promotes government regulation of a nation's economy for the purpose of augmenting state power at the expense of rival powers. right? So let me go through that one more time, because that's a lot to wrap your brains around, especially when you're just listening, right? It's an economic theory and practice that promotes government regulation of a nation's economy for the purpose of augmenting state power, meaning you use your gross domestic product, your trade surplus, all those other economic indicators to augment your state power. The stronger you are economically, the more you can throw your weight around on the world stage, or at least against rival kings and princes and nations. You build up your trade networks and your resources. You build up your nation's treasury. You have a strong economy, and you've got greater power, right? And you're thinking, okay, so really mercantilism is a thing that still exists even though we don't call it that. Yeah, that's pretty close to it. We don't call it mercantilism anymore, and we don't have it completely that closely tied together anymore, mostly because a lot of modern nations, especially the United States, get really very edgy about government regulations. Although that's just another way of saying controlling the rules of debate. So, right? And making your businesses behave themselves and think about something other than just their bottom line. But that's a lecture for another day. So we'll move on. All right, so trade, mercantilism, and then the third one is religion. Did the Christians in Europe did they still pine to finally win the Crusades and take Jerusalem and the rest of the Holy Land back from the Muslims? Yes, they did. Were they even thinking about it at this particular period of time? No, they weren't. Because, very simply, the Christian European West and the various groups running various component parts of all of the Muslim territories, which were the Middle East all the way through North Africa. And remember, it's not one state that governs that whole thing, just like it wasn't one group that governed all of Europe. Those two powers were pretty equal, right? They weren't getting anywhere. The Christians had tried the Crusades and failed, right? Holding territory while in the middle of theoretically enemy territory is really hard. An occupying army, right? And winning a war of occupation is incredibly difficult. Someday, ask me about basic understanding of the history of warfare. And one of the things that's right on the top of my list that you don't do is you don't start wars of occupation. They rarely work unless you have the kind of power disparities that, say, the Roman Empire did at its peak with all of the nations on the periphery. If you don't have that kind of imbalance, you're not going to be very successful in war of occupation. It's just not going to happen. And so when the Europeans, right, starting in the 11th century, started knocking on the door of Jerusalem, slaughtering everybody there and trying to hold territory, it's not a surprise that they could not keep it. And so by the time we get to the early modern period and even the late medieval period, Europeans had essentially given up on the notion that they were ever going to be able to take Jerusalem back without something extraordinary happening, right? The two forces were too evenly matched. And at this point, the Ottoman Turks had a much stronger military presence than a lot of the other earlier groups that had run the area, right? There are times when it was good, times when it wasn't good, but essentially, there was no give at this particular moment. The Ottoman Turks were simply too strong. And so they had a different idea. And this was born of the crusading impulse. They still wanted Jerusalem back. At least some people did, right? They're really truly zealous, hardcore religious types. Um, they did have a wild idea, right? And this you see especially in Spain when they're in the process of kicking all of the Muslims and all of the Jews out of Spain in the same year that Christopher Columbus sails the ocean blue, 1492, right? The same year. So that impulse is definitely there. So what they want to do is they want to find routes to India and Asia so that, and this is true, not taught a lot, now more often, but in old, especially high school textbooks and stuff like that, oh, this makes them all sorts of edgy, but it's absolutely accurate, right? The primary sources are clear about this, that religious leaders and national leaders, especially people like Prince Henry the Navigator in Portugal, who we're going to talk about in a minute, Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, right, which we know very well, they all had the same thought. Go to India, go to Asia, convert all the Indians and Asians to Christianity, and then get them to join up with the European Christians to have one massive pinchers movement against those who are holding Jerusalem and finally take the city back. That's what they wanted to do, right? One last massive crusade with essentially the whole known world against the Ottoman Turks. Then they would be able to hold it. And you're thinking, that's insane. Yeah, but that was a big deal at this time because they knew they couldn't win 1-1. And so they had to essentially shoot the moon, man. They had to throw the, pardon the bad Catholic pun here, a Hail Mary pass, right? They were so determined that they would actually even contemplate something this wild, right? And so religion was a huge thing, but not just to benignly spread the gospel, but to get enough converts so that they could swell their armies to large enough proportions to be actually able to finally seal the deal on the crusading impulse. There's a reason why when you look at depictions of the explorers' ships, especially Columbus, they have the same emblem as the Crusaders did during the earlier Middle Ages. A white background with a big red cross on it. That's the Crusaders' seal. That's a Crusaders' emblem. That is what adorned Columbus's ships when he sailed across the Atlantic. That's not an accident. Because Columbus was one of those people who absolutely believed this. Right? Yeah, he was an explorer, but he was also a religious zealot. All you have to do is look at his diary. It is loaded with this kind of talk. The reason that he was able to convince Ferdinand and Isabella to give him those ships when pretty much everybody else said no is that they were as zealous as he was. There's a reason Spain bankrolled that trip and nobody else did. Because the Spanish Catholics at that time, the Spanish Christians, who will rebuff completely the Protestant Reformation of the 16th century, who instigated the foremost use of the Inquisition, who were in the process of kicking out of their country every non-Christian that they could find. And not just kicking them out, but killing and torturing as well, Muslims and especially the Jews. That kind of fervent religious zealousness, that's building at this time, right? That's a big, big component of all of this. And you're thinking, oof, I guess I wish I hadn't known that. No, but one of the things that we do in history is that we take all of it, the good and the bad, the progress and the things that make us shudder a little bit. We have to know these things because that's why we study history, so that we can actually learn about the whole of the human story. One, because it's interesting, but two, and maybe, right, kind of an important thing, maybe we should learn from the things that we've done in the past. And if they are mistakes, and this is a whopper, don't do them again, right? Who knew that history could be so relevant and important? Just one of those things to think about as we keep going through this, right? It's so important that we see this as something more than simply an academic exercise or as something to reinforce our own biases. College is all about opening doors and opening our mind to new information. Everything we do should be to open the door. And then we've got to wrestle with it. Then we've got to think about it. Then we've got to track it down. And if you have questions, ask, right? And if you say, oh, I'm not sure about that, where's your proof? I'll show it to you. Because that's important too, right? Simply asserting a point of view isn't sufficient anymore. As college students, your job is to be able to support why it is that you say what you do, right? Why you think the way you think. Because, what you think isn't as important as how you think. You can hold a position as long as you can defend it, and as long as you can be persuasive in doing that, right? I mean, that's a part of it. And you're thinking, Dr. Grant, you're kind of off track of history. No. That's what history is. That's what we're doing. That's the job. That's the responsibility of professional historians to pass that along to students. And your job as a student, your responsibility is to be open to that information and then poke at it and prod it and think about it and reflect on it and study it, right? There's not a thing that you take in that you shouldn't digest and think about and reflect on. Don't just take it in as a given. That's dangerous business, right? Questions are always a good thing. But those questions have to be grounded in legitimate, good faith arguments and not just, well, I know, I have doubts about that, and so I'm not going to think any more about it. No, that doesn't work either, right? That kind of hopeless cynicism is just as corrosive as blind certainty. All right, we meet in the middle. All right, number 4. The last trigger is really technology. Because in order to actually go out and do what you want to do, in order to go out and explore what you want to explore, you got to have the ability to be able to do that, right? And so there are a couple of things, very simple, and I'm just going to kind of go through these very quickly because they are exceptionally important. They've been around for a while. The Europeans are just going to find a way to say, oh, wait, all these pieces can fit together, right? Because people have been sailing for forever, right? I mean, the human population put to water almost as soon as we could, right? I mean, you can go a long way back. I think we have examples of very early boats, which are just essentially crude bowls made with wood and animal skins and pitch, right? And this is especially down in Southeast Asia, especially. They set off into the ocean in these bowls probably 40 to 50,000 years ago. Let's go look, right? So people have been sailing for a long time. Technology has made that easier, safer, right? Now, the Europeans, the most important bits of maritime technology that they were aware of came from two places: the Mediterranean, so people who sailed around the Mediterranean and got very good at it, and to the north, the Vikings, right? Because by this time, the Vikings had settled down, and frankly, the Scandinavian countries had become a part of the growing European population and a part of the story. And so a lot of that old technology was there, especially square sails, all the rest. Most boats in the Mediterranean and the Viking longships were powered by wind and by muscle. And lots of guys, lots of oars sitting there. Yeah. Some of the earliest slaves that were captured in the Mediterranean world were set to the oars. That was their job, right? And they didn't care where they came from. They just needed able bodies. And so the stronger you looked, the better opportunity you were likely to get nabbed on the docks and thrown onto a boat. There you go. There's some excitement. Things obviously are going to have to get better and more technologically advanced the more and the farther you want to go. And so if you're going to sail out there in the open Atlantic, you need a better ship, right? And so we're going to go from the various road boats in the Mediterranean and the Vikings to crafts with deeper holds, not as broad, but ocean going, right? And so they need to be more stout, they need to be maneuverable, they need to be stable enough in the open water. And so we get what is called a caravel, right? That's just essentially the next step. And I don't have a lovely picture of it, but I want you to just Google that, right? Caravel. You'll see a million of them. They still like making them for old exhibits and stuff like that. They're really very good. Now, so you've got the boat, and one of the things that you can do is you get rid of all of the oars. You're just not going to have oarsmen on these boats. It won't work. But that's okay because the holds underneath the decks are going to be used for storage. Because the farther you go, well, the more stuff you have to take with you, specifically food and water. Because everybody has known from the very beginning that you can't drink seawater. It's going to kill you. Right? So you got to bring fresh water with you, which means that the longer the trip, the more you have to take, which means the more storage you need. Now, these guys were traders, and so they understood that they'll be able to pick up more water wherever they go, and then they're going to need to be able to bring goods back with them. So, larger holds. In the beginning, the men slept on the decks. Later, they will add. All right, so you got the caravel and then a couple of other things. You need to know what direction you're going, right? And you're thinking, well, duh, Dr. Grant. I mean, honestly, anybody knows that. You need to know where you're going. Well, in order to know where you're going, you need a mechanism by which that is able to be figured out. And the best thing, and it came up by Persian sailors, a compass, right? You set a float with a metal piece and a magnet on one end, or even without, and it'll find magnetic north. Ta-da! There it is. Mark it off, see how it all works, and now you know where to go. Compass. Perfect. The next thing you need is an astrolabe. And you're thinking, what? An astrolabe. Don't you have one at home? Everybody should have one of these. I could ask right now. I'm sure we could probably find one somewhere in my house, right? That's the wonderful thing about teaching from home is that I've got all my stuff somewhere around here. The peanut gallery, otherwise known as my family, is snickering at me behind all of this. So an astrolabe. If a compass tells you where you're going, an astrolabe does a very specific thing. And again, Google this, right? It tells you where you are. That's what it does. You use the stars at night, you take measurements. It's a wonderful sailing tool. And what you discover is where you are. If you know where you're going with your compass and where you are with your astrolabe, you can pretty much do anything. You can go anywhere, right? So a compass tells you where you're going, an astrolabe tells you where you are, the caravel gives you the ability to go where you need to go, and then there's one last thing that you need. Because see, for the longest time, people used basic functional square sails or triangular sails or anything like that. And they had to wait for the wind to be going in the right direction to go where they wanted to go. If not, you row. That's one of those, that's why you have oars, right? Well, the Persian sailors came up with a better idea. There's a triangular sail that you stick usually at the back of the boat. It's called a lateen sail. The lateen sail is awesome, right? Because what it does is it helps you direct the wind into your main sails. That's what you do. It essentially helps bounce it off. So you actually can now, as long as it's even just in the near vicinity of where you want to go, you get them set up and then you're off. So now we have the technology. Right? So we've got the technology, we've got the reasons, and now they're going to get going. And this is where we take our next step, right? Because now you need somebody who is going to say, yeah, this is an awesome idea. And I hate to tell you, it's going to take somebody who is in a position of power, a position of authority. And that's where this guy comes in. Prince Henry the Navigator. I mean, honestly, his title gives it away, doesn't it? He's Portuguese, 1394 to 1460 is when he was alive. And he is going to encourage the Portuguese to begin to explore the Atlantic. And his goal was very simple and straightforward. He wanted to find that alternate route to India and Asia. And Prince Henry, being a profoundly devout Christian, not only wanted to reopen trade routes, but also to enlist the Asians and the Indians in the struggle against the Ottoman Turks. You're thinking, wait a minute, he was a religious zealot? Oh, yes. Yes, he was. But he was also a pretty good navigator. He was a pretty good sailor, and he was the one who had the position of authority within the Portuguese royal family to encourage them to spend the money necessary to try all of this. And this is amazing, and this is important, simply for the reason that you needed somebody who had the political will and the political muscle to get them to open the purse strings enough to spend on this, because you've got to think about it, right? Think about his argument that he had to make to his family. I need you to spend a lot of money. I was going to say a boatload of money, but that was too cheap. That's a dad joke from a mile away. So I decided not to, except I did. You need to spend a boatload of money to get the ships built and crewed and the impetus to get out there and do this. Now, the sales job wasn't that hard because, well, the overland trading routes were drying up. That was a problem. And they did want to beat everybody else. How do you increase Portuguese power? We're back to mercantilism. The best way to do that is to improve the royal coffers, as it were, the royal treasury. How do you throw your weight around? You throw your weight around economically, and that's what they wanted to do. So he was able to convince them for trade and for national policy and national security, right? To use a modern term, that's not something that they would have talked about back then, but it fits very nicely, right? Religion, of course. And because they were right there on the ocean, they already had the leg up on the technological components of it and the access, right? They had the ports; those were already set. Those were ready to go, and they had the shipbuilding capacity, and so they were able to put out into the ocean first. And this starts it. This starts the whole thing. And it is spectacular and devastating. It's not long after they get out that they're going to start making some fascinating discoveries, right? Because here we have it. Here we have a map of the known world, or at least the known world that they cared about in the late 14th century, the 1300s, right? And you can see Portugal out there. I'm just not going to be good at this. I don't have a pointer. I probably should, but unfortunately it's all digital, so I can't really do that well, right? So there they have it. They're out there. And the first thing that they're going to discover is just see off the coast of North Africa, there's a bunch of little islands out there just off the coast of North Africa. Those are the Eastern Atlantic Islands. There's a group of 3 of them. The Canary Islands, which the ones we can see, right? And then the Madeira Islands, a little bit farther out. And then the one we can't see are the Azores, and they're smack in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, almost halfway between Europe and what will be called the Americas. But it's the Canary Islands that we really want to focus on, because very early on, even before Prince Henry was actually really getting people motivated, in the year 1341, right? So this is even before he was born, but there are some explorers, and this is what also got him motivated, is that there were some people who were out there who had said, well, no, I think there's stuff out there, right? Well, there's a guy named Nicolosa de Recco. He's from Genoa. And you'll notice that a lot of the mariners that we're going to talk about are from Genoa. That makes sense. Genoa is a port town, right? One of the most important port towns in all of the Mediterranean. And so if you needed a sailor, that's where you're going to find them. Well, Nicolosa de Recco in 1341 discovered that those islands that people had rumored were off the coast of North Africa actually were. And then what he discovered there was, well, islands, rich fisheries off those islands, and a fascinating thing that was growing there, sugarcane, right? Sugar, that's where we get sugar. Sugarcane and sugar beets. But sugarcane grew on those islands, and the local populations harvested that sugarcane, used it for obviously sweeteners, which most of Europe did not have other than honey and fruit, right? You need sugarcane to get sugar. All right. So early on, they discovered, but they also discovered something else. And that was the people who lived there. Because you see, the people who lived there had lived there for a very long time. These are what the folks that we called the Guanche. The Guanche had lived on the Canary Islands probably at least as far back as when the Sahara Desert became the Sahara Desert, which is about 6,000 BCE. When the Sahara, or North Africa, began the process of desertification, some of the people from modern-day Morocco probably decided to see what else was out there. Well, some of those of Berber descent found these islands right off the coast, and they had lived there ever since. Now, we had various reports of the people living on these islands in the ancient world. The not the Mesopotamians, the Phoenicians definitely wrote about them, the Greeks, the Italians, right? The Romans. Those from the Iberian Peninsula. They had talked about the people who had lived out there, but nobody really bothered because, frankly, it was on the edge of the known world, and nobody really cared because it was a long way away and it didn't seem like they were hurting anybody. And in the ancient world, nobody cared what they looked like or what languages that they spoke because, frankly, that's just the reality of the ancient Mediterranean world. Bunch of people from all over the place looking all sorts of different shades of everything with different languages, and people just rolled with that, right? I mean, that's the interesting thing. There was no racism in the ancient world because they didn't see each other in those ways, in those terms. And frankly, up until this period of time, we really don't see it. And we'll talk about slavery in just a second. So the Guanche are out there, and that's going to trigger some very interesting occurrences, not the least of which is that while Nicolosa de Recco's comments about the people who were living out there were fascinating for a while, nobody really paid them much heed because they didn't see the import of them, or they didn't see the value of them. They're just more people, right? Because that's all they were, right? And they were folks from a more rudimentary technological level. Okay? That's the thing. That's what they were. All right. But starting in 1402, the Portuguese, who are now truly wanting to flex their abilities and their muscles, political, military, and all the rest. In 1402, they begin what is called the conquest of the Canary Islands. And this sets a pattern that we're going to see time and time and time again. Now, when the Portuguese first arrived there, they discovered that they weren't particularly civilized, right? They had a lower technological level than the Portuguese did. By this time, the Portuguese were using early arquebuses, gunpowder weapons. They had steel blades. They had all this kind of stuff because they and the Spanish had been fighting against the Moors, the Iberian Muslims, for a few hundred years. And warfare sharpens technological development faster than anything else. And they also brought with them their very hardcore, zealous version of Christianity. And they got to the islands and they said, "Are you Christians?" And after they realized that they didn't speak the same language, and they learned the language, right? Which is something people just did. I mean, that's what you do. If you're going to trade with somebody, you have to learn the language. It's just one of those things, right? The rest of the world is, very comfortable being at least bilingual. It's only the United States where we think that that's particularly strange, right? Why wouldn't you want to have a second language in your back pocket or more? If you're a trader, you'd better be a polyglot, right? And so they are able to communicate with the Guanche. It's a different dialect, it's a different language, it's a different tongue, but they figure it out. If money's involved, you can always figure that stuff out. That's just the way that works, right? And then they say, "Are you Christian?" And they're like, "No." And they say, "You've got to convert." And the Guanche are like, "Why?" And the Portuguese and then later the Spanish will say, "Well, if you don't convert, we're going to conquer and enslave you." And the Guanche are like, "Well, you can try." Now, some of them will give themselves up because some of the islands were facing some fairly dire agricultural problems. And so they happened to hit them at a time when starvation was a real issue. So some of them said, fine, whatever. You want us to convert? We convert. You want us to say that we believe in your God? Absolutely. Is this going to get us out of the mess that we're in? It does. We're out of here. That's fine. This works. But many of the islands were like, not a chance. And they fought back hard. Because if you were going to say that, because some of them they actually discovered, right? They were given the choice. You can either convert or you're going to be enslaved. And some of the Guanche said, fine, we'll convert. It's better than being enslaved, right? And then the Portuguese turned right around and enslaved them anyway, because that's what they wanted to do, right? They, okay, the conversion was a lovely thing. That's awesome. But they really didn't want to treat these people as equals, because they didn't, that was not going to be the thing that was going to be financially beneficial to them. And so they enslaved them anyway. And so the rest of the Guanche are like, well, why in the world would we do that? That makes no sense whatsoever. So no, we're not going to do that. This is not going to happen, right? It's going to take them almost 80 years to conquer the Guanche. That's how just absolutely dogged and determined they are. But in the end, right? And this starts a trend in which the European explorers, right? And they just started off as explorers, now become conquerors. And the Guanche were the first. And the things that they're going to learn on the Eastern Atlantic Islands are going to be the things that they carry with them for the rest of the age of exploration. And that's why I sometimes call it the age of exploitation as well, or the age of conquerors, right? Whatever you want to call it, whatever floats your boat, as it were, right? That's fine. But know what's going on. Now, here's the interesting thing. This is before they really had a conceptualization of scientific racism that we are going to see develop in the 19th century. And so the question is, why did they enslave them? Well, did they enslave them because they were racist, that they saw themselves as a superior group? Some arguments have been made from a particularly good historian named Ibram Kendi, who argues in one of his most recent books, looking at the history of racism throughout, really starting with the Age of Exploration on. He's like, they didn't start out as saying, because the Guanche are different, right? And because all these other groups are different, especially when they're going to start the slave trade in Africa, they're not starting the slave trade because they're racist. They start the slave trade because it's in their economic self-interest. But because you can't just say to people, oh, and by the way, one of our new economic policies is we're going to capture and enslave other human beings and sell them on the open market. That doesn't work. And so you develop racist explanations to support your economic self-interest. This doesn't diminish the fact that they're racist, but remember, the economic self-interest comes first. And then they use, and which is probably even more dehumanizing, is the fact that they just use racist tropes and arguments to support their economic policy. And then it becomes a feedback loop, right? Once you've injected that into the system, and make no mistake, it's really injected at this particular period of time in European history. They inject it into the system, and then it becomes self-reinforcing. We can do this because those people actually are lesser than. They're not really fully human. And the Portuguese and the Spanish are going to have two really basic reasons why they can say that they're not truly human. And that's very simply this: they're not civilized and they're not Christian, right? That's what they start with. It's later that they will add the truly and exceptionally racist attitude of, and therefore they are less than us. Prior to this, slavery existed. make no mistake, slavery did exist, but not chattel slavery, right? Where if you were sold into slavery, you were there forever and so were your kids, and there was no opportunity for freedom. In the ancient world, you could get out. And the other thing is that in the ancient world, anybody could be a slave, no matter what you looked like. It wasn't based on your country of origin or your region of origin, your skin color. The slave traders of North Africa and Eastern Europe and the Middle East and all the rest, in the ancient world, in the ancient Mediterranean world, they would grab whoever they could. It did not matter. And in fact, many of the slaves were actually, well, as white as me from Northern Europe, because the Northern Europeans were seen as not quite as smart. Big and dumb is how they often described them, right? The dim-witted, blonde-haired, blue-eyed brutes from the forests and the mountains. They didn't care. But starting with the Guanche, all of a sudden, and it's Christians that are going to do this, and they will use scripture to support their bigotry. They will say, oh no, the people who can be enslaved are those who aren't really human, and you can tell by the color of their skin. And they use that as essentially in the beginning as a cover for their own economic self-interest. How do we make the selling of human beings palatable? They're not really human. And then we're off to the races. And by the 19th century, that ghastly system of dehumanization is going to be given a sheen and a patina of science behind it. There are different races, except for one inescapable truth. There aren't. Homo sapiens. One species. Different ethnicities, different places in the world, right? But not different races. It was economic self-interest that drove them to create the racist tropes that we now use and fight against every single day. And it was done because these early explorers wanted to turn a profit. And they wanted control. And they wanted a way to be able to excuse their conquest of peoples they had no business conquering. And so, right, they're off. They do it to the Guanche. They will do it to everybody else that they meet in this age of exploration that does not look even remotely like them. When Christopher Columbus meets the Taino peoples, right? Cuba, Bahamas, yeah, they'll do the same thing. Now, there are a couple other things that they learn, right? That's the whole business of the first one we talked about just now is ethnocentrism. Simply stated, it's a lot like egocentrism. Egocentrism is I come first, everybody else isn't as important, I'm better than everybody else, right? Ethnocentrism is the same thing. My people are the most important people. What we want is more important than what you want, right? That's very simple. And, oh, by the way, we're better than you are. We are farther up the chain of life than anybody else. So just, that's what they want to make sure that everybody gets to understand. All right, so, and then we talked about the beginnings of the slave trade. And again, yes, the slave trade had been in existence since probably the moment civilizations emerged, but not at this scale and not based solely on racist criteria. It just didn't happen that way. And it wasn't chattel slavery, right? You did not see essentially the commodification of human beings at the scale that we are going to see in the early modern period. It's stamped there for everything that is going to happen. It is the thing that powers Europe's explosion into the world scene. Remember how I talked about mercantilism, essentially government policy to build up economic strength? They did that based on the slave trade. Those who got into the slave trade were the first ones out into this business and into the world. And so it becomes something categorically different than it was in the ancient world. And it's built on these tropes and on the dehumanizing attitudes that were developed at this time. All right, a couple of other things. The next one is they discovered plantation farming. I'm not going to spend a long time on this, but something that's really important. All right, plantation farming. What does that mean? Well, in Europe, and frankly throughout most of the world, every farm grows a series of crops. You don't have a lot of single product farming, right? You had some of that with wine grower or for grape growers and olive groves and all that kind of stuff throughout the Mediterranean, but they will also diversify just enough so that they could feed themselves, right? Because most farms are essentially, they fed themselves, and then if they got big enough, then they could feed others. Plantation farming gets rid of the very notion that we're going to do anything other than growing one crop, and we're going to grow a lot of it, because it's the commodification of farming. It is farming finally as big business, right? And so you're thinking, okay, so what's going to get them thinking about plantation farming? The Canary Islands and sugarcane. Essentially, they're going to deforest the Canary Islands, and they're going to plant as much sugarcane as they possibly can. They don't care about the environmental impacts because, frankly, right, the Guanche live there. Who cares? It's not theirs. They can just wreck the soil until it's used up. And then you move on, right? You find other places that can grow that stuff because they have an ample market. That ample market is Europe and North Africa and even into parts of the Middle East. Sugar, oh my goodness, right? You can make a lot of profit based on that. And so you don't grow wheat, you don't grow other things, you don't grow root vegetables, you don't grow anything else. Like, you're not trying to support a family, you are trying to make money, period. That's it. That's the list. That's plantation farming, right? And then everything is focused on growing a lot of that crop. And that's it. That's your job, right? In order to do that, you need labor, right? Because the people who were leaving Europe to go off and do these explorations and settling in these new islands and all this kind of stuff, they weren't going there so that they could become, salt of the earth farmers. They were out there to make some money. In order to do that, the slave trade worked perfectly for them, because then you don't have to pay your employees. And this is one of those cynical things. If owners of businesses could get away with not paying people, they wouldn't, because then they could maximize their profits, right? The slave trade does that so evidently, right? You maximize your profits because you've got no labor overhead. You pay a flat fee at the very beginning to buy that human being that you've just, bought on market. And you put that person to work, and the only thing that you have to do is to make sure that that cog in your machine is healthy enough to do the work that needs to get done. And so all you have to do is spend some money on food. Done. Right? Plantation farming. They are going to export this wherever they go next. All right. Next thing they're going to learn about all of this is that long distance voyages work. Long distance oceanic voyages. And this is amazing, right? They discovered that as long as you keep going out there and keep exploring and keep your head about you, you're going to be able to do this. These long distance voyages work, which means you've now just stretched the map amazingly. It's so much easier to explain to somebody, well, we're going to take a risk on going in that direction because you can say, look what we've done so far. Oh, that makes sense, right? That's going to work. All right, so long distance voyages. So ethnocentrism, slave trade, plantation farming, long distance voyages, these are all the things that have been learned by these early explorers and, yes, conquerors and exploiters. Let's use the words all together. The last thing that the Europeans are going to discover is disease. No, they didn't just discover it at this point, right? They know that periodically, and they had just lived through it, right, with the Black Plague wreaking havoc in Europe in the 14th century and other plague outbreaks. They have seen this time and time and time again, but what they never would have gathered, what they never would have guessed is the just spectacularly damaging effects that European diseases, or the diseases that most Europeans carried around with them, either in their own bodies or in the creatures that lived with them, was how just devastating this is going to be in these populations that they were going to encounter for the very first time, like the Guanche. But even more so once they get across the Atlantic. But they're going to see it in the Guanche first, because at some point when the Guanche were actually beating the Spanish and the Portuguese, a smallpox outbreak hit. And while some Spanish and Portuguese died, thousands of Guanche just dropped. And then there was a measles outbreak. And that was the end of it. Because the Guanche had minimal protection, minimal immunity from these dread diseases. Because you see, disease transmission takes a number of things, right? Because most of us live in what we call epidemiological zones. If you don't do a lot of traveling, if you don't bring a lot of new stuff in, you're essentially going to only be exposed to the diseases in your region. We are a living example of what happens when epidemiological zones, when we go through them, right? COVID-19 is a disease that is carried by bats. Bats specifically from a unique part of Asia, right? It's an animal-borne disease. Because we live in a deeply interconnected world, diseases don't stay where they originated from. Remember, the Black Plague started out in the marmot communities, right? The bacillus loves marmots because of their underground warrens, and then, of course, fleas bite the marmots, and then all the rest. That started in Southeast Asia, right? And people were smart enough to leave the marmots alone when they were acting weird. But trade and travel is going to be one of those things that breaks through this, and it's going to create havoc when it comes to disease transmission. And there are very few things. I'm going to run through this list fairly quickly, all right, for disease transmission. Really important, though. First one is long distance trade and travel. Very simply put, people are going to be breaking through all those epidemiological zones and all those trade caravans and all that movement back and forth of human populations, and they're going to carry with them all of their stuff, which means that they're going to have rats, right, and other things. And so you're going to be breaking through those epidemiological zones, and they do not know the germ theory of disease. And so there is no possible way that they understand exactly why this is happening, but it is happening. But for those who are up and down those routes, they're going to be exposed to more diseases, which means if they survive, they should have some basic immunity to those. That builds up in the body, right? For those who don't do a lot of that and aren't exposed to a lot of that, they don't have the same immunities, right? That's what we're seeing right now. That's why a vaccine is so important, because that essentially launches that whole process much faster. All of a sudden, we're like, oh, wait, okay, I do have immunities. That's what a vaccine does, right? In this particular time, if you were exposed to disease and you survived, then you had an immunity, right? And some immunities can be passed down, but frankly, it's just a genetic disposition, right? But even that, it's just generation after generation exposed to these very same things. And immunity builds up within those communities. And when you're going to hit those communities that don't have those immunities, it's going to be devastating. All right, a couple of other factors. The next one is urbanization, meaning people who live in cities are going to be inundated with more diseases than those who live in the middle of nowhere. And again, look what happened with COVID-19. It broke out first in the big cities. Why? Population density, right? That's the biggest thing. The disease is able to jump from one person to another, depending on how it is propelled, in this case, aerosols, right? Once it's gone airborne and you've got a lot of people in small in small areas, congratulations. You're going to get more disease transmission in urban settings, period. And back then, it was even more so because then they had the problem of sanitation and hygiene, right? And again, COVID-19 is just such a great example of this, because all we have to do to help limit the spread is wear a mask and wash our hands. We know the germ theory of disease. We should know better. This is why we're doing this class like this, right? This helps break the transmission chain. Cities are just petri dishes waiting for new diseases. But if you live in a city, you're going to be exposed to more of those, and so it's going to be easier for you, right, to build up immunities. For those people who live out in the middle of nowhere in the rural areas, not as much, because they're just not exposed to as much. This makes sense. I mean, it really is not that complicated, but it's important for us to say. All right, a couple of other things. One is climate, and that makes a difference. Where you live is going to determine which diseases that you're going to be more exposed to, right? Generally speaking. All right, last one of this, and that is domesticated animals. This is going to be particularly important when Columbus crosses the Atlantic. Why? Well, because the people in what we call the Americas didn't domesticate a lot of animals. In Europe, Asia, Africa, they domesticated seemingly everything, right? Cats, dogs, cows, goats, sheep, chickens, man, you name pigs. Oh, and pigs are the worst. They really are. They're disgusting creatures, and there's so many diseases that come from pigs. It's no wonder that two major world religions say, don't eat pork. It's really very simple. It makes perfect sense, right? Right? Without modern processing, you couldn't pay me enough to touch the stuff. They're just disease ridden, right? Horrible, just horrible. That said, right, they domesticated everything. Europe, Asia, Africa domesticated everything. Ducks, geese, golly, you just name it. We're surrounded by animals and they have diseases. And some of those animals pass their diseases to us. Birds, pigs, cattle, ugh. It's a never-ending list, right? That's why we have swine flu epidemics and bird flu epidemics, right? Because we also have those animals really close to us. In a typical medieval village, most of your animals were literally underfoot or up in the eaves, right? Pigs ran the streets at night. Dogs and cats were everywhere. And so it's just one of those things. All right, so you jump across the Atlantic, and you know what? There are two animals that the native populations to the Americas domesticated. Llamas, guinea pigs for food. That's it. That's the list. They had no horses, cattle, pigs, especially, not in the same way, right? They did not domesticate animals in the same way. And so all of those diseases. All right, so what's going to happen is that you're going to get all those people and all that stuff, and you're going to take that across the Atlantic, and you're going to expose all of these new peoples who have no immunities to all of these dread diseases. And that's a problem. And so when we get to the point where we're now going to see something more than just gentle probing of the Atlantic, once they're really getting out there, right? All of a sudden, they're going to go everywhere, right? The Europeans, once they figured out that they can get these long distance voyages, they go everywhere. By 1487, Bartolomeo Diaz rounds the Cape of Good Hope. That's southern Africa, right there. Everything's mirrored, and so I always get confused. But they get around Africa in 1487. 1492, Columbus sails the ocean blue. And now all of a sudden we're realizing that Columbus wasn't all that hot, right? I mean, he was a good mariner. He's a good sailor, but he really got out there because he was able to convince Ferdinand and Isabella that he was going to be able to find the trade routes, number one. And yeah, I was going to be able to convert all of those new people to Christianity. He was also wrong and right at the same time. Right? The circumference of the Earth is 24,000 miles. 24,000, just over a bit. We've known that since the time of the ancient Greeks. Oh, there's the other thing. All of a sudden I realized I hadn't said this out loud. Nobody thought the world was flat. Nobody believes that. Nobody ever believed that, right? They've known since the time of the ancient Greeks that the world was round. I mean, honestly. If you do any kind of work on the open ocean or even on a big enough body of water, you know that the ocean is not, or the world's not flat. You know why you realize that? Because if the world is flat and there's a boat, right? All of a sudden I realized that I'm doing that, and I have to go back to this scene because I was drawing. Right? So there's a boat. If the world is flat, okay. Your two boats out there, right? They're going to seem very small, but you're going to see the whole thing all at once. But if you've ever been on the open ocean or have you ever been on a large enough body of water, you know that that's not true. You don't see the whole boat just very small because the Earth is curved, right? And so if your boat is out there and the other one is over here, right? I'm not a good artist. Oh my goodness, that's never more apparent than just right now. When they're coming close to each other, you know what they're going to see first? Because this is what happens because you live on a world that's not flat. You're going to see the top of the sail first, right? That's what you always see. They've known that the world was not flat since the very beginning. As soon as they started putting boats out in the open ocean, and frankly, just because they can see in large enough places that there's a curvature to the whole thing. That's one of those myths that just if you learn nothing else in this class, just promise me that you will never ever give anybody credit who says, no, really, the world's flat. No, it's not. There's ample evidence. Please stop. You're killing me. All right. So Bartolomeo Diaz gets out there in 1487. Columbus gets out there in 1492. And of course, Columbus, once he gets to the first islands, the Bahamas and Cuba, he says, I have found very many islands filled with people innumerable, and of them all I have taken possession for their highness, by proclamation made and with royal standard unfurled, and no opposition was offered to me. Yeah, nobody said, oh no, we don't belong to you. That's because, of course, Columbus made the proclamation in Latin. How many people, indigenous peoples of the Bahamas or Cuba, would have known how to respond in Latin, right? First time. And so Columbus is like, they're all ours, woohoo! I've conquered these lands and these people. And you're thinking, no, that's not the way this works. And yet, that was good enough for the people back in Spain, right? So he sails across the Atlantic in 1492. John Cabot reaches the New World, right? Which is a title that they give it, because by the northern route in 1497, meaning that he hits the coast of Canada. And around the year 1500, 1501, they really do decide that, yes, indeed, this is a whole new series of continents. And that had to have blown their minds, that all of a sudden the world was a heck of a lot bigger than they ever thought, right? Vasco da Gama reaches India in 1498. Ferdinand Magellan's crew will circumnavigate the globe in another 20 years. In a short amount of time, they've gotten all the way around. It's astonishing. It really is. It's like when we went to the moon in the 1960s. We just woke up one morning and said, yep, we're going to do this. And that's essentially what they did. They sailed around the world. There was no place left they hadn't been. Right? And it's amazing. But immediately on the heels of that, and I'll leave you with this, in the 1520s, led by Hernan Cortez, the Aztecs were conquered. In the 1530s, Francisco Pizarro led an expedition and they conquered the Incas. In the 1540s, Francisco Montejo conquered the Mayans. By the middle of the 16th century, the Europeans had conquered some of the most significant civilizations of what they now call the Americas, named for Amerigo Vespucci, another Italian explorer who discovered most of the South American coastline. They explored and then they conquered. And in their wake, they brought their religion, yes, but they also brought slavery, plantation farming, disease, and yes, their technology. But it changed the world for good and definitely for ill. It is a hard thing. And I'll wrap up with this last piece. In 1494, right? This is just 2 years after Columbus has gone. Now, by this point, Columbus has gone twice. And they signed what was called the Treaty of Tordesillas. The Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494 was an agreement between the Portuguese and the Spanish and the Roman Catholic Church. Those three sat down at the table, and what they did is that they drew a map of the New World as it had been discovered up to that point. And they drew a line, an imaginary line from north to south that completely and evenly bisected the known world or the known lands. That line ran right down through the Atlantic, and it was equidistant between the eastern Atlantic islands that the Portuguese held and the Indies, as they called them, the Bahamas, Cuba, all the rest, that the Spanish held. They drew that line, and in 1494 they said everything to the west of that line belongs to Spain. All of it, whatever they discover. Everything to the east of that line belongs to Portugal. All of it, whatever they discover. They did not consult the Europeans, anybody else. They did not consult the Africans. They certainly didn't consult the indigenous peoples and the civilizations of this new world. They divided the world between themselves. What was interesting, of course, is that when it was discovered that South America was actually was a continent, the Portuguese were thrilled because what they discovered is that that imaginary line went right through this new part of the continent. And so they named that new part of the continent an imaginary land that people had been putting on maps for years. They put imaginary islands out there in the middle of the Atlantic called Brazil. And Portugal used that name, which is why in the New World, there are 4 languages that are spoken, none indigenous. They are the 4 languages of the conquerors. In Central and South America, everything to the west of that original Treaty of Tordesillas speaks Spanish. To the east of that, Portuguese, which is why Brazilians speak Portuguese. And in North America, while there was no treaty that they signed, this is going to be how it works out as well, because we speak English and French. 4 European languages in the New World. Thanks, everybody. This has been a lot. There's a lot to review. I know it's a little bit longer than last time, but we had lots to cover. And so I thank you for your patience and your willingness to chug through all of this. I look forward to our next lecture in which we'll talk about the Renaissance. If you have questions, let me know. And I'm going to guess that you've got lots of them. So ask. Let's do this in our discussion threads on Blackboard, right? And so start firing off those questions and let's have a conversation about the material that I've covered today. All right, thanks everybody. I look forward to seeing you for the next lecture, and we're going to try to set up some time to get together for a Zoom or Google Meets kind of call. We'll make it a short one this time, and then I will see you next time. Thanks everybody.